By the time Cataclysm was over, it seemed like we had settled into a routine when it came to expansions and what we'd see in them. There would be a main antagonist from existing Warcraft lore who drove most of the expansion story and who would be the final boss of the expansion. If there's a new class, the new class would fit in with the lore, maybe even mimic the main antagonist in some way. And given that Azshara, the ancient queen of the Night Elves who summoned the Burning Legion into Azeroth in the first place, was a very powerful sorcerer, tied to the old gods just like Deathwing was and was still alive somewhere in the world, I figured Azshara would be the perfect main antagonist for whatever came after Cataclysm. Plus, I figured that the Sea Witch, a neutral hero from Warcraft 3, would be the perfect next hero class. I mean, hunters are the only class that can really use ranged weapons effectively, and sea witches could use bows as well as attack spells. And since they're kind of like a cross between a hunter and a shaman, they could have a healing spec too, which would be exactly what the game needs since the last class was a tank. Plus, sea witches were ranged, and since the last class was melee, sea witches would be perfect. But, as well as sea witches and Azshara fit with each other and WoW, Blizzard had other ideas. The fact is, every expansion up to and including Cataclysm built on lore from the Warcraft real-time strategy games, and Blizzard started thinking, if WoW keeps borrowing material from the RTS games, pretty soon we're going to run out of material to borrow. So they instead decided to start making new lore, unique to World of Warcraft, that didn't borrow much at all from the RTS games. And they built a brand new continent that was barely mentioned at all in the RTS games, Pandaria. Though I will say that Blizzard built the new Monk class off of the Brewmaster neutral hero from Warcraft 3. Besides that, Pandaria was all new. And I have to say, the art department really did a good job with Pandaria. The temples and walls and buildings really do evoke the feel of ancient China, and the Shah look amazing, forbidding, and obviously evil. On the subject of the Shah, Blizzard broke the pattern they started in Wrath of the Lich King, and they didn't really have an obvious main antagonist for this expansion. They didn't really need one to drive the story. This time, the characters themselves drove the story just fine without a main antagonist. Really, up until Mists, WoW had been pretty skimpy on story. There was next to no story in vanilla in the Burning Crusade, and Wrath of the Lich King had a little with the Siege of Undercity. Cataclysm was different. Each zone had its own separate story with interesting characters, cutscenes, a coherent chain of events, and a satisfying conclusion. While each zone's story ranged between okay and great, the stories didn't really tie in with each other at all. While a few characters were present in more than one zone, the things you do in Vashj'ir with Bud and his mercenary crew don't really factor in much to what you do with Bud's crew in Uldum. Also, each zone's story doesn't really play much into what happens in the next content patch, so each story that we got in Cataclysm was pretty much self-contained. But in Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard went all out with storytelling. The events and character changes from earlier zones and patches were distinctly felt and drove the story in later zones and patches. You save Prince Andiun in the Jade Forest and meet him again in Karasang Wilds and Kunlai Summit and the Valley of Eternal Blossoms. You meet him again in patch 5.1 when the Navy appears for the Alliance. The list goes on. And the stories you play through have a real effect on the world around you. Blizzard even went so far as to change the very landscape based on the things that happened during the stories. Blizzard did a lot to reveal who the deities were who protected Pandaria by having you quest and adventure right alongside them. They showed how Garrosh had forgotten all the lessons he learned about honor in Wrath and Cataclysm, and how he'd become much more bloodthirsty, greedy, and proud. They showed how Garrosh's dreams of conquest had turned Jaina from an idealistic young woman who wanted and believed in peace into a racist who neither believed in nor even wanted peace anymore, and who had no qualms about imprisoning her own citizens just because there was a chance that some of them were working for Garrosh. But it wasn't all bad news. While it showed some characters becoming more villainous, it also showed characters becoming or staying heroic. It showed how idealistic Anduin was and is, and how, even though his idealism put his life in jeopardy more than once, he was still pushing for and believed in peace. It actually showed Moira Thaurissan, who had been a borderline villain in Cataclysm, and her Dark Iron Dwarves, who were an antagonist faction in Vanilla, becoming loyal and honest members of the Alliance. It showed how Vol'jin stepped up to the challenge and kept the Horde together in its darkest hour, and how Varion, who had once been as racist as Jaina is now, becoming a just, wise ruler who knew when to end a war, and who didn't let all the awful things the Horde did to him when he was a gladiator make him forget that he needs to be a wise, just, and honorable king. The story flowed from landing in Pandaria all throughout the continent as you explored it and back together into the raid dungeons as you progressed into them. All throughout the expansion story, the same themes came up again and again. Emotions can overwhelm you and destroy you if you don't keep them in check. Patience, hope, wisdom, and determination are virtues that you need in order to defend yourself from threats within and without, and to be a functional individual who doesn't succumb to evil. And of course, the very question they brought up in the trailer. What is worth fighting for? Blizzard did an excellent job weaving the story through nearly every aspect of the game in Mists. And while Mists was building new lore for World of Warcraft that didn't totally rely on the real-time strategy games, Blizzard did a lot to make Mists of Pandaria tie in with the rest of World of Warcraft. Pretty much every raid tier had some Titan lore attached to it in one way or another, and it turned out that the Mogu were another stone race that the Titans created, a lot like the Vrykul or the Earthen from Northrend. It also turned out that the Mantid were to Pandaria what the Nerubians were to Northrend, and what the Silithid were to Kalimdor. They were a race, even more ancient than the Trolls or Earthen, who worshipped the old gods and predated the Titans' arrival on Azeroth. They hinted that their old god, Yeshuraj, wasn't quite dead, and that they would stand by his side if he ever came back. Yeshuraj kind of turned out to be the hidden main antagonist of Mists of Pandaria when Garrosh unearthed Yeshuraj's heart and took it to Orgrimmar, and then it turned out that the Shah all came from Yeshuraj's last breath. And once you defeated Garrosh while he was acting as Yeshuraj's avatar, you basically finished off Yeshuraj and cleansed Pandaria from the Shah once and for all. This was an epic conclusion to the storyline, which hinted all along that the player character himself or herself was the reason why the Mists parted, and why Pandaria opened itself up to the Alliance and the Horde despite all the mayhem that their war brought. Another thing worth saying, the Alliance and Horde weren't the only factions with an interest in Pandaria. Wrathion, Deathwing's devious yet well-meaning son, was also working in the shadows at every step in the story. Throughout every event that happened in Mists, he was keeping an eye on it, having you help him build weapons and research the Mogu, the Titans, and the Shah, all so that he could find a way to counter a Burning Legion invasion he saw looming on the horizon. You never quite knew whether Wrathion was on the side of good or not until the end. He never really spoke of compassion, understanding, or peace. From his perspective, things don't happen unless you make them happen, and he'll do whatever it takes. The deaths of armies, manipulating people, anything, all to make Azeroth ready for the Legion's arrival. Wrathion did not have much respect for the virtues of kindness, patience, or wisdom. It's sad that he didn't learn those. The August Celestials really tried to get through to him, but in the end, when kindness, justice, and honor won out over ambition after Garrosh fell, Wrathion absolutely lost it. One final attempt to teach him wisdom failed, and the expansion's last comment about him was, "He's not very nice." That's going to turn out to be very true in Warlords of Draenor, where he lets Garrosh escape and form the Iron Horde, but, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. All in all, the story and artwork in Mists were the best they've ever been, and if there's one thing that makes me want to buy Warlords of Draenor, it's the story. I really want to see what comes next and how Blizzard will weave the story of Draenor into the expansion. Of course, the fact that I am not praising the gameplay in Mists tells you that I found the gameplay lacking. In fact, I found it lacking in a lot of different ways, and I'll get to some of those in the next part. Not all of them, some of them. Yeah, it's going to take more than one part to cover everything.